The river carried the sound before the city saw it. Artillery slamming into the waterfront, the flat crack of explosions echoing off stone and glass. The Karen shook with the impact. Men on the riverbank covered their ears as windows burst outward and smoke lifted into the autumn sky. War had arrived in Khorramshahr, and it came without mercy. Civilians sprinted for stairwells. Mothers pulled children into cellars. The smell of gunpowder and burning oil seeped through every alley before the first Iraqi tanks nosed across the border. In September 1980, Iraq hurled its armies into Iran. Khorramshahr, a port city with its hands on the Shatt al-Arab waterway, became the first great prize. Iraqi commanders boasted it would fall in 48 hours. They came with armored columns, with artillery that pounded the docks, and with aircraft that stitched rooftops with gunfire. Inside the city, defenders dug in. They were conscripts barely trained, scattered regulars, and neighbors who had traded shovels for rifles. They turned intersections into kill zones. They dragged buses across streets, piled sandbags at doorways, and cut firing slits into plaster walls. They vowed the city would not fall quickly, whatever the cost. The first weeks were chaos. Families tried to escape south by car, only to be strafed on open highways. Others crowded into mosques, hoping the domes of stone would hold. Basements filled with mattresses and buckets of water became shelters where bread was rationed in whispers. Children learned to stay silent when the sirens wailed. Volunteers from surrounding villages poured in with old rifles and homemade grenades. They joined students, shopkeepers, and laborers on the barricades. Iraqi troops renamed the city Al-Muhammara and prepared to claim it swiftly. Instead, the streets held. The battle dragged on for more than a month. Every bridge was mined, every alley contested. Men carried grenades in shopping bags, darting from doorway to doorway. Women cooked bread and ferried water to front lines only blocks from their homes. Teenagers scrawled slogans on walls between firefights. Iraqi tanks blasted holes through buildings, but each gap only created another position for snipers. Nights shook with the rhythm of artillery, and by morning the streets were littered with casings, shattered glass, and the burned husks of cars. What was supposed to be a 2-day seizure turned into what fighters began to call the City of Blood. By late October, exhaustion ruled, ammunition ran out, food dwindled, defenders fought with what little they had, but the barrage never ceased. Iraqi tanks ground forward, block by block, house by house. Explosions ripped open apartments where families had once eaten dinner. The last pockets of resistance were cut off from each other, crouched in ruins that shook under constant fire. The end came in firestorm. Thousands died where they stood. Survivors were marched into captivity. Iraqi soldiers raised their flag and painted slogans across ruined walls. For Iran, the loss was not just territory. It was humiliation cut into the nation's pride. Radio broadcasts mourned Khorramshahr as though it were a fallen comrade. Posters bearing its name appeared in villages hundreds of miles away. Refugees carried tales of children buried in rubble, of neighbors vanishing in smoke. Songs were written that turned its name into a vow. Someday it would be taken back. In Tehran, mothers held vigils. Fathers who had lost sons swore others would take their place. The war stretched on. Trenches scarred the deserts. Chemical weapons burned lungs. Both sides traded shells like currency. And through it all, Khorramshahr waited in occupation. Its mosques were turned into bunkers. Schools became barracks. Streets echoed with the sound of a foreign tongue. Iraqi soldiers set curfews, searched homes, and looted what little remained. Families lived on scraps. Some smuggled letters north, describing hunger and humiliation, telling of families torn apart, and of quiet acts of resistance, an old man refusing to leave his home, children sneaking food to prisoners, women whispering prayers for the city's return. Nights were worse, the silence broken by boots on patrol, the crash of doors being forced open, and the quiet sobs of those taken away. By spring 1982, Iran gathered its strength for Operation Bait ol-Muqaddas. To commanders, it was strategy. To fighters, it was revenge. Tens of thousands surged south, soldiers, guards, and volunteers with plastic keys to heaven hung around their necks. Artillery thundered across the horizon. Bridges became killing grounds, contested inch by inch. The ground trembled with explosions. For weeks, the front devoured men like firewood. Nights glowed with tracer fire. Days carried the cries of prayers shouted into smoke. Entire units were swallowed whole, but still more came forward, fueled by the memory of the city that had been lost. In late May, Iranian forces reached the outskirts of Khorramshahr. What followed was war at its most intimate. Every block was a fortress. Iraqis had fortified houses, dug firing holes, and left booby traps in stairwells. The fighting became a nightmare of close quarters. Soldiers fired through holes smashed in walls. Grenades clattered down staircases. Bayonets met in hallways thick with dust and glass. Tanks tried to nose down narrow streets, only to be stopped by barricades of debris and flaming wrecks. Bridges across canals ran red with blood. At night, the city shook with overlapping echoes, rifles, mortars, shouted commands, and the cries of the wounded trapped under rubble. On May 24, 1982, Khorramshahr fell again, this time to those who had lost it. Iranian fighters poured into the streets, kissing the ground, lifting rifles skyward, and weeping openly. They called it liberation. For Iraq, the retreat was humiliation broadcast across the Arab world. For Iran, it was proof that sacrifice could bend the tide. But the price was staggering. Tens of thousands dead, entire neighborhoods in rubble, the riverbanks lined with bodies. Khorramshahr's name became legend, sung in ballads, written in prayers, carried like a banner of resilience. The aftermath was bitter. Families who returned found homes without roofs, walls riddled with bullets, gardens turned to graves. Mosques lay gutted, their domes cracked. The river that once carried barges now carried oil slicks and burned timbers. Children scavenged for scrap metal where they once played football. Shops were shells, streets littered with broken glass, the smell of smoke still in the air months after the fighting ended. Survivors spoke of victory, but knew the truth. Khorramshahr had been taken in blood, retaken in more, and left broken forever. The war did not end. It dragged on for 6 more years, devouring lives and treasure. But Khorramshahr remained its most enduring story. The city seized in pride, lost in defiance, and reclaimed in sacrifice. Veterans carried the memory to their graves. Families carried it in silence. The scars in its walls became scars in Iran's history, deep and permanent. Each year, anniversaries are marked by mourning and flags raised in remembrance of the city that defined what the conflict truly was. A war that ground nations down to bone. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.